I've worked for 23 years as a nurse in psychiatric emergency units. Those wards where the most serious cases arrive, the most intense episodes, the crises that no one can control at home anymore. And there's one thing I've learned in all these years. When a person is at the height of a religious delusion, when they scream that they're possessed, that they see demons, that hell is opening up beneath their feet, everyone around them thinks it's just brain chemistry, just neurons firing incorrectly, just illness. But I've seen things in those rooms, in those endless nights, that don't fit into that simple explanation. I've seen people who never studied religion describe details of ancient texts. I've seen patients speak languages that no one taught them. And I've seen, with my own eyes, the exact moment when their terror transforms into peace, a peace that doesn't come from any medication. My name is Christina, I am 47 years old, and today I am going to tell 7 stories that kept me awake at night, that made me question everything I learned in college, and that in the end showed me that there is something much bigger happening behind these cries of despair. If you're feeling this way with me right now, stop everything, subscribe to the channel, turn on notifications, and leave a comment below about where you're listening from and what time it is there, because the next story will change everything forever. The first time I felt something more was going on was with a 26-year-old boy named Raphael. He was admitted on a Saturday night, brought in by his mother and 2 brothers who could barely hold him down. Raphael was yelling that he had made a pact with the devil, that he had sold his soul, and that now, they were coming to get him. His eyes were wide open, his voice hoarse, deep, different. His mother cried incessantly, saying that her son had started getting involved with wrong things on the internet, occult groups, ritual videos. We put him in a holding room, administered a mild sedative, and I stayed on duty observing him for the next few shifts. For 2 nights in a row, Raphael didn't sleep. He stayed huddled in the corner of the room, staring fixedly at the wall as if he saw something we didn't. Sometimes he whispered strange names I had never heard, and shook his head, repeating, "No, no, I don't want to go." On the 3rd day, when I went in to check his vital signs, Raphael grabbed my wrist with a force I hadn't expected. He looked me straight in the eyes and said, in a voice that didn't sound like his, "They're here. They're waiting for me to give up. But someone is fighting for me, someone of light is there too." I felt a chill down my spine, but I kept my composure. I asked who was fighting over him. Raphael started to cry, but it was a different kind of cry, softer, almost of relief. He said he saw a woman dressed in white, that she stood between him and the shadows, and that she kept repeating his name, as if she were calling him back. I asked if he knew this woman. Raphael shook his head and said, "It's my grandmother, but she died when I was 5. I barely remember her face, but I know it's her. I know by the way she says my name." That night, something changed. Raphael began to pray. It wasn't a memorized prayer, not the Lord's Prayer or the Hail Mary. It was a conversation, a direct plea, asking for forgiveness, asking for help, asking for the light to return. He prayed for hours, until his voice was hoarse again, but this time from exhaustion, not hatred. And when the sun rose on Sunday morning, I entered the room and found Raphael sitting on the bed, calm, his eyes red from crying so much, but his face was at peace. He looked at me and said, "She won. My grandmother won. They're gone." I called the on-call psychiatrist. We ran all the tests, adjusted the medication, and Raphael was hospitalized for another week under observation. But the delirium was over. He told the whole team that in the final moments of the battle, as he called it, he had seen his grandmother hold his hand and pull him away from a dark abyss. He said he felt her hand, warm, firm, real. And that when he agreed to follow her, everything went dark for a second, and then he woke up in the living room, alone, but free. Raphael's mother brought an old photo of his grandmother. We showed it to him without warning. Raphael immediately started crying and said, "It's her. It's exactly her. I saw that face. I saw that woman save me." The medical team noted everything as protective hallucination induced by extreme stress and guilt. But I looked at that boy and saw something that no medicine had done. I saw gratitude. I saw faith. I saw someone who had returned from a very dark place, and who didn't return alone. But I still didn't imagine that this was only the first layer of what I was about to witness. A few months later, a 38-year-old woman named Patricia arrived at the ward. She was involuntarily admitted by her family after 3 days locked in her room, screaming in languages no one understood and scratching her own hands until they bled. Patricia had no prior psychiatric history. She was a math teacher, married, with 2 young daughters, and a stable life. But suddenly, according to her husband, she began to talk strangely in her sleep, waking up scared, and saying that something had entered her. When I first saw Patricia, she was sedated, but even so, she was writhing on the stretcher. Her eyes were rolling, her mouth was moving incessantly, and sounds were coming out, sounds I had never heard before. They weren't words in Portuguese. They weren't words in English or Spanish. It was something guttural, rapid, rhythmic. The nurse who was with me, Joanna, has been an evangelical for years, and she turned pale. She pulled me into the hallway and said, "Chris, I know that sound. I've heard it in deliverance sessions at church. This isn't ordinary delirium." I didn't know what to think. I spent the entire shift watching Patricia. When the sedation wore off, she opened her eyes and looked at me with a strange lucidity. She asked where she was, and I explained. Patricia started crying and said, "I'm not crazy. I know it seems like I am, but I saw something black enter inside me. It was the day I passed by that abandoned yard near my house. I felt a weight, a horrible sadness, and since that day I'm not myself anymore." She recounted that at night, when she tried to sleep, she heard voices laughing, mocking her, saying that her daughters would suffer, that she would die alone, that God had abandoned her. And the more she prayed, the angrier the voices became. Patricia said she tried to go to church, but couldn't get in, literally couldn't cross the threshold. Her legs froze, her heart raced, and she fainted on the sidewalk. During the following days, Patricia had intense episodes. In one of them, I was taking her blood pressure when she slowly turned her head towards me and said, in a voice that wasn't hers, deeper, colder, "You will also be mine." I felt my blood run cold. But I didn't let fear take over. I held her hand firmly and said, "You don't belong here. She belongs to the light, and you have no power over her." I don't know where those words came from. I had never done that before. Patricia started screaming, writhing, but at the same time she was crying, as if there were 2 people inside her fighting for control. And then, in the midst of that chaos, she shouted a name, "Grandma Maria. Grandma Maria, help me." And at that very moment, her body relaxed. Her eyes closed. Her breathing became calm. I stood there, holding her hand, feeling my heart pounding erratically in my chest. When Patricia woke up hours later, she was different. Her face was rested, her eyes clear. She looked at me and said, "My grandmother came. I saw her. She was glowing, all in white, glowing. She put her hand on my forehead and said, 'Go away, in the name of Jesus.' And I felt something come out of my mouth, come out of my chest. I felt it come out." She repeated this several times, always crying, always giving thanks. The husband brought their church pastor to pray in the room. The medical staff allowed it because, technically, it didn't interfere with the treatment. The pastor prayed, anointed Patricia's forehead with oil, and she remained at peace for the rest of her hospital stay. A week later, she was discharged. She went home. She went back to her daughters. She went back to teaching. I ran into Patricia 6 months later, by chance, at a market. She hugged me, cried again, and said she had never felt that weight, that presence, again. She said that now she went to church every Sunday, that she prayed with her daughters before bed, and that she knew, with absolute certainty, that she had been freed by something greater, something that came in the form of the grandmother she loved so much. And I, who had always been trained to explain everything through science, began to realize that perhaps, just perhaps, there were doors that science didn't yet know how to open. But what I saw after that made me certain. It was early Thursday morning, almost 3 o'clock, when they brought in a 17-year-old boy named Marcos. He was tied to a stretcher, foaming at the mouth, his eyes completely white, with no visible irises. His mother came running behind him, screaming that her son was possessed, that he had performed a ritual with his friends in the cemetery and that since then he was no longer himself. I had seen many serious cases, but that one was different. Marcos was howling. It wasn't a human scream. It was an animalistic, raspy sound, as if several voices were coming out of him at once. And he had absurd strength. 3 security guards held him down while they applied chemical restraint. But even drugged, Marcos kept moving, his head turning from side to side, his mouth uttering words I didn't understand. Nurse Joanna, who was with me again, crossed herself and began to pray softly. They isolated Marcos in a special room with cameras. The protocol was continuous observation. I was responsible for checking on him every 30 minutes. And every time I went in, the atmosphere inside that room was oppressive. It felt like the air was heavy, the temperature was dropping, an inexplicable sadness was taking over your chest. Marcos remained motionless most of the time, but his eyes followed us around the room, even when his back was turned. It was impossible. But it happened. On the second day of his hospitalization, Marcos's father managed to get permission to bring in a priest. The priest was young, around 40 years old, very serious, and came with a small suitcase containing holy water, a crucifix, a Bible, and a written ritual. He asked to be alone with Marcos for an hour. The medical team hesitated, but the psychiatrist in charge authorized it, provided that the camera remained on and 2 security guards waited outside. I watched everything through the camera in the monitoring room. The priest entered, blessed himself, and began to pray. Marcos, who had been quiet until then, exploded. He screamed, spat, and tried to bite the priest. But the priest didn't stop. He continued reading the ritual, sprinkling holy water, holding the crucifix against the boy's forehead. And then something happened that I saw, but that to this day I can't explain. The room light flickered. It wasn't an electrical fault, because the other lights in the hallway were working fine. And then, for 2 or 3 seconds, the camera image became distorted, as if something passed in front of the lens. A shadow. A shadow that had no physical form. I looked at Joanna, who was next to me, and she had seen it too. She clutched the rosary she carried in her pocket and whispered, "My God, get out of here." When the image returned to normal, Marcos was unconscious. The priest was on his knees, crying, praying aloud the Lord's Prayer. The security guards rushed in. They checked the boy's vital signs. Everything was normal. But Marcos was at peace. His face had relaxed, his muscles had loosened, and for the first time since he arrived, he seemed to be truly asleep, not sedated. When Marcos woke up 6 hours later, he remembered nothing. Nothing of the cemetery, nothing of the screams, nothing of what had happened. He looked at his mother and asked why he was in the hospital. His mother broke down in tears and hugged her son. The priest returned, spoke with Marcos, and calmly explained everything. Marcos listened in silence, then asked to pray with the priest. They prayed together. And I, who saw it all through the window of the door, felt an emotion tighten in my chest that I couldn't explain. Marcos was discharged 3 days later. He went back to school. His mother sent a message to the ward thanking them. She said her son was doing well, that he had started smiling again, that he was attending church with her. And I kept looking at that camera, at that recording that was automatically deleted after 72 hours, and I thought, how many times do we discard what we don't understand just because it doesn't fit into what we've learned? But the next case would show me that sometimes, it's the children who see more clearly. A 9-year-old girl named Isabella arrived with her aunt, who was her legal guardian after her parents died in a car accident a year earlier. The aunt was desperate. Isabella had stopped eating and sleeping, and spent the entire day talking to herself in her room, staring at the corner of the wall. When her aunt asked who she was talking to, Isabella would say, "The man in black. He wants me to go with him." The initial diagnosis was complicated grief with trauma-induced hallucinations. Isabella was admitted for observation and medication adjustment. But from the first day, Isabella didn't stop drawing. She would take colored pencils and paper, and always draw the same thing, a tall, all-black, faceless figure standing next to her bed. And on the other side of the bed, she would draw a woman with long hair and a blue dress, holding her hand. I sat with Isabella in the recreation room and asked her about the drawings. She looked at me with those deep, tired eyes and said, "The lady in blue is my mother. She comes every night to protect me from the man in black. She says he wants to take me, but he won't succeed because she won't let him." I felt a pang in my heart. I asked if she was afraid. Isabella shook her head and said, "No. Because my mother is with me. She hugs me and sings that song she used to sing before going to sleep." I asked what song it was. Isabella started humming softly. I didn't recognize it. I called her aunt. Her aunt heard it, and her face turned white. She said it was a song that her sister, Isabella's mother, had invented when Isabella was a baby. Nobody else knew it. It had never been recorded. It had never been sung outside that house. And Isabella was only 8 years old when her mother died. She couldn't remember it so clearly. But she remembered. And she sang. And she said that her mother was there, every night, protecting her. During her hospitalization, Isabella was accompanied by a child psychologist specializing in grief. In the sessions, Isabella recounted how her mother told her not to be afraid, that she should live, grow, and be happy. That one day they would meet again, but that now was not the time. And that the man in black would leave when Isabella decided she wanted to stay. On the last night before her discharge, Isabella had a dream. She told me about it the next morning while I was changing her bed sheets. She said that in the dream, her mother hugged her tightly, kissed her forehead, and said, "Now I'm going away, my love. But I'm always here." And she pointed to Isabella's chest. "In here. Always." Isabella said that when she woke up, the man in black was no longer there. And neither was her mother. But she didn't feel fear. She felt peace. Isabella was discharged from the hospital, returned to her aunt's house, and entered long-term therapy to process her grief. But she stopped seeing the man in black. She stopped talking to herself. She started eating again, playing, smiling. And whenever someone asked if she missed her mother, Isabella would put her hand on her chest and say, "She's here." She never really left. I watched a 9-year-old child teach an entire team of doctors and nurses that love doesn't end with death. That there's something that transcends, that protects, that continues. And I began to understand that perhaps these patients we call delirious, perhaps they are seeing something that we've forgotten how to see. But nothing prepared me for what I myself would experience a few months later. Before that, however, he had a case involving not one person, but 5 at the same time. It was the strangest, most impossible to explain episode I've ever witnessed in a psychiatric ward. It was a Friday night when 5 patients arrived from the same house. They were 4 women and 1 man, aged between 22 and 50, all members of an alternative religious group that held spiritual sessions at home. According to the police who brought them in, neighbors called reporting screams and noise, and when the officers arrived, they found the 5 on the living room floor, convulsing, talking at once in different voices, their eyes rolled back. They separated the 5 into different rooms. Containment protocol, sedation, monitoring. But what happened in the following hours was inexplicable. The 5 patients, in isolated rooms, without any visual or auditory contact between them, began to shout the same phrase, at the same time, in the same intonation, "He's here. He crossed over. He's not going to get out." I was in the hallway when I heard it. There were 3 voices coming from 3 different rooms, perfectly synchronized. I felt the hairs on my arms stand on end. I called Joanna, I called the security guards, and we went from room to room checking. And yes, the 5 of them were saying exactly the same words, at the same rhythm, as if they were reciting a memorized text. But it was impossible. They were isolated. The doors were soundproof. There was no explanation. The on-call psychiatrist rushed in, increased the sedative dosage, but the 5 continued to struggle, scream, and repeat phrases in Latin that no one on the team understood. Joanna called the priest from her parish. The priest came, bringing 2 more priests with him, and they asked for permission to perform a collective exorcism ritual. The hospital administration refused, but allowed them to pray outside the rooms. And it was when the priests began to pray that something changed. One by one, the 5 patients began to scream louder, as if they were in pain, and then, silence. A complete, abrupt silence. Joanna and I rushed into the first room. The patient, a 35-year-old woman, was lying on the stretcher, her eyes open, crying softly. She looked at me and said, "He's gone." They kicked him out. We went to the other rooms. All 5 said the same thing. "He's gone." Some were crying with relief. Others were in shock, trembling. But they all said they had felt something leave, something heavy, something that had been holding them back. In the following days, all 5 told the same story, with identical details, despite having had no contact with each other. They said that during the spiritual session, they tried to invoke a guiding light, but that something went wrong. That a dark presence entered, took control of them all at once, and that this presence said it would use them to spread despair. They all described the presence in the same way: cold, heavy, hateful, and impossible to expel alone. But when the priests prayed, everyone felt a warm, strong light enter their chests and drive out the darkness. One of the women said she saw the image of Jesus Christ, shining, placing his hand on her head and saying, "Go away." Another said she saw an angel with a flaming sword. The man said he saw his grandmother, who had been a nun, praying beside his stretcher. Everyone had different visions of figures of light, but everyone felt the same liberation. The 5 were discharged a week later. They abandoned the alternative religious group. They started attending Catholic and evangelical churches. And all of them swore never again to meddle with spiritual invocations, without understanding what they were doing. I kept thinking about that for months. How could 5 isolated people shout the same words at the same time? How could they describe the same dark presence, and then the same release by the light? Science had no answer. The protocols had no answer. But I started to have one. I began to understand that there is a spiritual battle happening all the time, beyond what we see. And that when someone opens the wrong doors, voluntarily or involuntarily, something can enter. But also, there is also something of light, something powerful, something that can expel any darkness, if we ask for help. And that certainty was going to become even stronger after what happened to me. The 6th case was the most documented, the most witnessed, and also the most controversial of my career. A 62-year-old man named Antonio arrived, an ex-convict, addicted to crack for 30 years, and homeless. He was picked up by social services in a severe psychotic episode, completely dehydrated, shouting that he had killed people, that the victim's blood was on his hands, and that now, they were coming to collect. Antonio had a history of violence, involvement with drug trafficking, and according to his file, he had been out of prison for 2 years and had never managed to reintegrate into society. When Antonio arrived at the ward, he was unrecognizable, so dirty, thin, and injured. He had a strong smell of urine and open wounds on his arms. The staff bathed him, treated his wounds, and placed him in an observation room. But Antonio didn't improve. He shouted people's names, begged for forgiveness, and said he saw the victims around his bed, covered in blood, pointing at him. The psychiatrist prescribed strong antipsychotics. Nothing worked. Antonio remained in despair, banging his head against the wall, scratching his arms, begging them to stop looking at him. And then, one night, Antonio suffered a cardiac arrest. I was on duty. The alarm went off. We rushed to his room and began resuscitation maneuvers. 2 minutes of chest compressions, shocks, adrenaline. 3 minutes. 4 minutes. The doctor was about to declare him dead when Antonio's heart started beating again. He suddenly opened his eyes, took a deep breath as if he had come out from underwater, and began to cry. But it wasn't a cry of despair. It was a cry of relief. Antonio looked at me, grabbed my hand, and said, "I saw it. I saw everything. I was falling into a black hole, and there was fire, and screams, and I knew it was forever. But then he appeared." I asked who. Antonio said, "Jesus. He appeared. All in white, shining, and he pulled me. He pulled me outside. He said it wasn't my time yet, that I had to go back and tell people what I saw. That I had to ask for forgiveness and change." Antonio spent the next few days telling anyone who would listen. He described what he saw in terrifying detail: the abyss, the fire that didn't burn his body but burned his soul, the despair of knowing there was no way out. And then, the light. The hand that held him. The voice that said, "You still have time." The entire team witnessed the change. Antonio stopped shouting. He stopped looking at the victims. He began to pray, to ask for the Bible, to talk to the hospital chaplain. He asked to contact the victims' families to ask for forgiveness. Not all of them agreed to speak with him, but some did. And Antonio, crying, asked for forgiveness on his knees, over the phone. When Antonio was discharged, he went straight to an evangelical recovery center. 6 months later, he returned to the ward to express his gratitude. He was unrecognizable. Clean, combed, smiling. He brought a handwritten letter for each member of the staff who cared for him. In mine, he wrote, "Nurse Christina, thank you for not giving up on me when I was dead. God used your hands to bring me back. I saw hell. I saw Jesus. And now I know there is salvation for anyone." I kept that letter. I read it whenever I get tired, whenever I think about giving up. Because Antonio showed me that no matter how deep someone has fallen, there's always a hand outstretched waiting to pull them back. But nothing, absolutely nothing, prepared me for what I was about to experience firsthand. It's been a year and a half. I was at the end of a double shift, exhausted, operating on autopilot. It had been a tough night, 3 serious admissions, a patient who tried to hang himself in the bathroom and whom we barely managed to save. I was emotionally and physically drained. I left the ward at 7 in the morning on a Saturday, got in my car, and started driving home. I remember being on the main avenue, the traffic was already starting to get heavy. And then, out of nowhere, I felt dizzy. My vision blurred. I tried to pull over, but I couldn't. The last thing I remember is seeing the red light ahead of me, and not being able to brake. I crashed. I crashed hard into the back of a truck stopped at a traffic light. My car was completely smashed, the airbag deployed, and I passed out. But I didn't lose consciousness. Not completely. I felt something strange. I felt like I was leaving my body. I saw my destroyed car from above. I saw people running, screaming, pulling at the door. I saw blood on my face. But I didn't feel pain. I felt lightness. And then I saw a